I ordered the Novation Launch Control XL3 for my DAWless hardware setup. And after a lot of hassle, I ended up returning it. If you're considering buying the LCXL for your DAWless setup, you're going to want to watch this whole video and understand the various limitations that it has as a DAWless controller. I'm also going to supplement Novation's user guide for the device, since it lacks clear explanations of what the LCXL can and cannot do with the current firmware. I purchased the LCXL for my hardware setup, the core of which consists of a Novation circuit tracks as the brain and a Korg monologue as my hands-on knob per function type monosynth. I don't really like playing with the pads on the circuit, so I had been using an Arturia Minilab 3 to control its synthesizers. The Minilab has a decent selection of knobs and faders to complement the keyboard, and I had been trying to design a control layout for the Arturia that would allow me more immediate, hands-on control of various parameters within the circuit. However, I was struggling to come up with layouts that I liked because of the limited number of knobs and faders on the Minilab, and the fact that I couldn't include all of the parameters that I desired, since it can program CCs but cannot program NRPNs. I'd seen some of the infomercial synth channels on YouTube covering the LCXL when it launched, and initially my curiosity was only mildly piqued. But what actually made me take interest in the LCXL was not the LCXL itself, but The Drop by Newsit. I gasped pretty hard for The Drop when Bob made his commercial for it because it looked like the perfect device for my use case. So I watched Newsit's tutorial video to understand what it can do and how it works. It looks like a really well-built device, and I appreciate the care and attention to detail that seems to be put into this labor of love creation. The developer says that he built the Drop to solve various issues that he's encountered over the years when performing live using hardware. However, after learning the ins and outs of Drop, I recognized that its features and functionality overlap quite a bit with the features and functionality of the circuit, particularly in that the snapshot feature within Drop is more or less the same thing as the scene functionality within the circuit. Regardless, there was no way I could justify spending $1,000 on a MIDI controller. So with that knowledge in mind, I began reconsidering the LCXL as an option, and went to Novation's site to read the user guide for it. And this brings me to the point in the video where I'll begin critiquing the LCXL. The LCXL is equipped with three 5-pin DIN MIDI ports, which are in, out, and through. Similarly to the circuit, the through port can be assigned as either a through port or a second out port. The main reason that I decided to order the LCXL was because of the information contained within the user guide. The description of the external MIDI in setting says that it merges incoming MIDI data at the in port with MIDI data in the custom mode and routes it to MIDI out port 1. I interpreted this to mean that I could hook up an external controller like the Arturia to the MIDI in port, and that the LCXL itself would receive the incoming MIDI data stream and be affected by it, but my interpretation was erroneous. I was hoping to have some of my most commonly used parameters assigned to the knobs and faders on my Arturia controller, and then have every parameter available assigned to different modes within the LCXL. Based on what the user guide says, I was expecting the duplicated parameters to update on the LCXL when I adjusted them on the Arturia, but this is not how the LCXL functions. The MIDI in on the LCXL only functions as a pass-through for the MIDI data. To avoid confusion, the import should really be named MIDI through input port, or keyboard controller pass-through port, or something like that, since its behavior is kind of atypical compared to how data is usually received at the MIDI in on the average synth. I emailed Novation customer support about this. Initially, the rep who responded told me that the values should be updating on the LCXL as I was expecting. However, after explaining to him a second time that this was not occurring, he confirmed that my experience aligned with the device's design and that the duplicated parameters will not update from the Arturia controller to the LCXL. He did, however, inform me that the Novation development team will be investigating this functionality and that he would update me with further news on the case. But the rep also informed me that the LCXL values would update if I used USB MIDI to connect them. So to be clear, the MIDI import is basically just a pass-through for a separate MIDI controller. The data coming in does not affect anything assigned within the LCXL. For whatever reason, MIDI through is a global setting, unlike external MIDI in and output port settings, which are per mode. Another limitation in regards to the MIDI routing is that while each mode can be assigned a unique output configuration, this customization has been implemented in an all or one thing type manner. As such, the modes can't output combinations of two, such as USB and DIN 1 only, for example, or DIN output 1 and 2 only. This seems like a needless limitation, given that there are much older MIDI controllers that can route these combinations, not only for the mode, but for every single assignable button, knob, and fader on the device. Sadly, there is no option at all to customize MIDI output routing per individual control on the LCXL. Another big shortcoming? The LCXL can only store a measly 16 modes at a time. This is really disappointing given that, once again, there are much older MIDI controllers that offer significantly more storage space than this. Despite containing 16 storage slots for the modes, the LCXL can only store up to 15 user-made custom modes at one time. The Novation reps say that the 16th mode is reserved for third-party developers, so that there is a uniformity to the CC assignment per control. I actually had to listen to Novation's explanation a few times before it made sense to me because it really doesn't make much sense to me. The 16th mode is no different than all of the other modes in their factory default state, all of which are the same as the default user template that populates in the configuring software, Novation Components, when designing a new mode from scratch. And as a DAWless user of this device, it's not clear to me that I'd ever actually be able to make use of the 16th mode anyway, since it seems to apply to software like VST plugins or DAW extensions. So for the DAWless user, the 16th mode is rendered unusable for no particular reason. Why is it designed like this? Why can't there simply be instructions and components to map third-party apps to a default template? Not that these instructions would be necessary at this time, since, there currently aren't any third-party apps available for Mode 16. Meaning that Mode 16 cannot be modified by the user because Novation prioritized reserving the slot for something that doesn't even exist. Once again, I have to wonder why this device was made in such a hamstrung way. Why isn't there a setting allowing the user to toggle between third-party mode and user custom mode? There are additional limitations regarding MIDI channel assignments. Each individual knob, fader, or button is assigned by default to the global channel of the LCXL. But can alternately be custom assigned to its own MIDI channel 1 through 16. However, the modes themselves cannot be assigned to their own MIDI channel. So any control that doesn't have its own MIDI channel assignment will act on whatever channel has been selected as the current global channel. In the user guide, there's a tip that indicates that the mode button can be held down and made into a momentary button for quickly changing to a new mode. However, I was never able to get this to work. It would be nice if it did work, because the only available method for changing modes can be confusing and or irritating depending on the circumstances. Modes are changed by first pushing the mode button. This transforms the 16 lighted buttons at the bottom of the device from whatever color they were to the blue and white of mode selection mode. What I found myself doing was accessing the mode menu and changing the mode, but forgetting to push the mode button a second time to bring it out of mode selection mode. It would be nice if there were an option to have mode selection mode automatically turn off after selecting the new mode. Or, if the momentary feature described in the user guide actually worked, that would be great too. The LCXL does not have any mode editing functionality built into the hardware itself, other than the settings for external MIDI in and output port routing. Any and all editing of the controller's parameters, values, light colors, etc. are edited using components. And once again, I'm reminded that there are much older MIDI controllers that can be edited directly on the hardware itself and don't require a software editor. While the software editor is more efficient overall, it is nice to be able to quickly modify settings directly on the controller if, for example, a simple programming mistake needs to be corrected. So if I accidentally assign the wrong CC to an encoder on the LCXL, there is no way to correct this without connecting the LCXL to the computer, opening components, modifying the mode, saving the mode, and then resending the mode template into the LCXL. Additionally, the interface for sending the modes into the LCXL is needlessly unorganized. The user-made modes have saved names, but the display grid to select which slot to save a mode to only shows the slot's respective number, even when there is a named mode saved to it. This is a feature that Novation implemented better on the circuit, as during the same process, a blank grid in components shows the numbered slot, but once a pack is saved to each slot, the number disappears and is replaced by the pack's name. Overall, the UI of the software is okay. It can perform bulk editing, and the cut, copy, paste functionality works for the controls, which makes it easier to quickly reorganize a layout, but the process would benefit from a clipboard. However, there is not a right-click menu, so everything has to be done using the keyboard shortcuts. By far, my biggest frustration with the configuration software is how limited the customization options are, especially when compared against much older MIDI controllers. There's not an option to set default parameter values. Only minimum and maximum values can be defined. This shortcoming becomes especially problematic when taking into consideration that the LCXL does not save the current state of the parameters when the power is lost. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself, so let me back up a bit. There is no power button on the LCXL, and there is no sleep mode that I could find. It remains fully lit and active as long as it is receiving voltage. Okay, now back to why not having default values is a problem. The LCXL always boots up from what I call a zeroed out condition, which is really annoying when used in combination with the circuit. When it's freshly powered up, all of the values on the LCXL are set to either 0 or the lowest assigned value, meaning that if an encoder is accidentally nudged and activated in this condition, which is easy to do, then the value will jump to 0 or the lowest value, which can create all kinds of issues, some obvious, some not. And this paradigm is created every time the device is powered up. The only way to prevent a nudge-based disaster is to go in and pre-adjust every single knob so that the values align respectively with the values in the circuit, eliminating the potential for value jumping, thus rendering accidental nudges more innocuous. To be effective, this process would need to be done every time the device is powered off and then back on, which is pretty ridiculous, considering how easily this could be avoided entirely by having the option to configure default values for every parameter and components. Another feature that would mitigate this problem, and again, I'm baffled as to why this functionality doesn't exist in the device, but another way to avoid this problem would be for the LCXL to have the ability to do something like, I don't know, save. Why can't the LCXL save? I think there should be a few boot options to choose from. The zeroed out state could remain an option, but it should also have the ability to boot to the last used values, as well as an option to boot to the default values, although this would obviously require the ability to assign default values in components. This one's more of a missed opportunity than a deal breaker, but I really wish there was a virtual pot to complement the numerical display of the value being adjusted. My Arturia controller has a virtual pot that appears on the screen during value adjustments, and I really appreciate the extra visual feedback. One of my biggest complaints with the circuit is that the method of determining the position of the knobs by how bright or dim the associated light is really does not work for me. So I like that the LCXL has a screen that displays numbers, but I think it would really benefit by having a virtual pot on the screen as well, as it could help train the user to better understand what light brightness level the value corresponds with. One bigger shortcoming of the display is that it is locked into a basic 0 through 127 presentation. The knobs, buttons, and faders can't be adapted or customized, meaning that the components editor doesn't offer a bipolar setting for plus-minus parameter values. The lack of adaptive labeling is especially pronounced on the buttons, as they lack not only the bipolar differentiation, but an on-off labeling option as well. Additionally, the buttons can only be set to momentary or toggle functionality, and, as such, lack normal and step functionality, options that are, again, available on much older MIDI controllers. It is possible to make the buttons function as normal, but this requires setting the functionality to momentary and entering the same number for both the minimum and maximum value. The lack of step functionality, i.e., stepping incrementally or decrementally through values, is particularly disappointing, since this would pair well with the over 50 colors available to assign to each button. Speaking of buttons, the LCXL has many of them that are functionless and unusable. At the bottom, there are 3 buttons that don't function at all in DAWless use: the mute button, solo button, and the difficult to see button with the Novation logo on it. The arrow buttons, labeled as page and track, only access and navigate the settings menus of the LCXL in DAWless use. The record and play button are also non-functional in DAWless mode. These buttons weren't even designed to be compatible with Novation's own products like the circuits. It may not seem like this is a big deal, and in my use case it wasn't a big deal. In a hybrid setup, however, it creates an issue because the play button will become active once a compatible DAW is connected, but it will only activate and deactivate playback of the DAW, not the hardware directly, meaning that any hardware synth not being controlled by the DAW's MIDI will require manual operation, since DIN synced hardware will not respond to the play button. The method for changing the global MIDI channel on the LCXL is kind of clunky, and I don't understand why Novation didn't make better use of the LCXL's layout and make the MIDI channel switching function similarly to how it does on the circuit. I'll explain. The method for accessing the mode settings is to hold Shift and hit the mode button. Doing this makes it possible to go into each mode and change the available settings in a way that makes sense and is fairly convenient and efficient. To me, it would make equal sense to be able to change the global MIDI channel in a similar manner, such as holding the Shift button in combination with another button, maybe one of the unused buttons, thereby activating the MIDI channel selection menu, wherein the user could choose whatever mode button corresponds with the desired global MIDI channel. The lighting could be implemented in a way that intuitively guides the user, like on the circuit. Because the circuit doesn't have a screen. It's really wild to me that the LCXL is made by the same company that developed a very successful, completely screenless device like the circuit. But instead of a circuit-like interface, the process of selecting the MIDI channel consists of holding both of the track buttons simultaneously and using either the arrow buttons or one of the encoders to scroll through the MIDI channels. This is another one that isn't a deal breaker, just an obvious missed opportunity. One feature the device has that I like is the shift check functionality, which allows the user to see what the values of the encoders are without making any adjustments to them. This is performed simply by holding the shift button and twisting the desired encoder to see what the value is. It's a great feature. Unfortunately, it does not work on the faders. The faders can't be shift checked. I suppose that this makes sense, given that the faders actually change physical location when adjusted, but it can create issues. For example, I was bouncing back and forth between two modes that Novation has preloaded into components: Circuit Tracks Mixer and Circuit Tracks Synth. In the Mixer mode, the faders are set to the track levels of the 8 tracks within the circuit tracks. In the Synth mode, the last 4 faders control the amp envelope. So fader number 5 was controlling kick drum level in mixer mode and amp attack in synth mode. I would have the level of the kick set to maximum. So if I accidentally bumped fader 5 while I was in synth mode, the amp attack would jump to near maximum, leaving me scratching my head, wondering where the synth sound had disappeared to. So for me, the best approach was to have the faders always control the track levels, regardless of the mode. But here again, I ran into a limitation I was not expecting to encounter, since this is representative of yet another basic feature that the LCXL lacks, and that is a catch or pickup mode customization option for each fader. As designed, the faders of the LCXL are permanently in jump mode. If there were an option to change them to catch or pickup mode, then the attack fader could be set this way, and I would not have to worry nearly as much about the sound changing if the fader were accidentally bumped while in synth mode. With all of this in mind, I decided to return the LCXL. During the process of setting up the return, I was given 2 options: receive a full refund and return the LCXL, or receive a $50 refund and keep the LCXL. This would have brought my total cost down to about $225, but I still didn't think that it was worth it. Realistically, without a significant firmware update, I wouldn't spend more than $75 for an LCXL. There is just way too much wrong with it. But this offer was not enticing to me because I'd already found something better as a replacement for the LCXL. It's about 20 years old, and you'll never guess who manufactured it.